Hi everyone, I'm Agnes and I'm part of the education core of DIPO Open 2020 and I'm going to deliver the answer in the true or false section. First question, a framing of why an argument is important will result into direct advantage to the team. The answer is false. Just because it is said to be important does not mean it is truly important. Um, the first logical reasoning is because every team in the debate can literally claim that their argument is important. So if it gives direct benefit to one team, it applies to every team, right? So it means that the effect or the benefit itself is neutralized because everyone can have the benefit. So what a judge should do is two things. Firstly, you have to look into the relevance of what is said to be important in the existing discussion or debate itself. It is if it is too far-fetched or if it is less relevant in the other discussion, it is not considered to be that important. But secondly, you also need to look at the process analysis on the team that a team mentioned as important. Just like any other argument, there needs to be less logical gap for a thing to be considered as important. So what a judge should do generally is be an average reasonable person. You should still weigh whether or not an argument or an assertion that a team say to be important is truly important by really looking whether a team has proof, whether it is true, whether it is relevant, whether it is truly important, and what is the elaboration and analysis um, in a holistic manner. Second question, closing team can win the debate by providing new principal argument. The answer is true. Closing team can bring literally anything new and relevant in the debate, be it new principal argument, new practical argument, new example, new context, anything can make a closing team win. Third question, Prime Minister should receive below average score for not providing mechanism in the debate. No, the argument made by Prime Minister does not merely stop at mechanization. So there are a lot other contribution that you still can note from Prime Minister, and probably more important than mechanization itself. For example, likelihood, exclusivity, and whatnot, right? And Prime Minister have more contribution than that. Not to mention, some debate requires lesser mechanization than the other debate. So I think it's not an important part that will really deter Prime Minister to have below average score. Fourth question, each speaker's speech should address practical and principal argument. The answer is also false because there is no rigid speaker role that someone should fulfill, as well as argument. So strategically, as a team, you can just bring a principal argument or just a practical argument or just a full rebuttals. There is no rigid way for you to convey and structure your speech. Last question, arguments from closing that depends on the same premise the opening should not be counted as an extension. The answer is also false. The debate does not only revolve on one premise, but more analysis. It means even within the same premise, you can still have more exploration in terms of examples, likelihoods, exclusivity, actors, right? So it does not limit closing team to play under the same premise, but take a different angle. And closing can still win regardless of having the same premise, but there needs to be new contribution from the closing team in other aspects. That wraps the true or false section. Thank you all.
Okay. Share screen. I will share this one. Share. Hey, hi guys. I'm Risky, one of the eight for DIPO Open. I would like to discuss the short written questions that you just answered for the independent adjudicators and accreditations. So starting on with the first question here, we have the first question as follows. You're chairing around alongside with two panelists. Panel A's initial decision was the same as yours that gives first to CG, second to CO, third OG, and fourth to OO. Meanwhile, Panel B placed fourth to OO, first to OG, second to CO, and third to CG. During the discussions, Panel A justified closing win because they brought new contextualization and spoke more fluently. Panel B, on the other hand, tried to compare the likelihood and response from each team, especially between CG and OG's contribution. After the discussions, Panel B was willing to change their decision following your initial decision. How do you score each panel and why? Okay, so for this particular question, the answer that the H core have agreed on would be to give panel B higher score than panel A. The approximate score that we give would be to panel A less than 5, to panel B 6 to 7. As a caveat, more information should be needed from how each of this panel deliver the reasonings for like panel A, what's the new contextualization for panel B, what how they would compare the likelihood and responses, whether it's something that's relevant and whether it's something that's meaningful to the debate and the discussions going forward. I think in conclusion, more information should be needed, but I think the approximate score based on the provided information would be as follows, right? Reasoning behind that would be twofold. So I would explain why panel B first and like why panel A deserved that score. So panel B, I think despite awarding different ranks to different teams, I think panel B had given a more comparative reasoning, especially directly between the intertwined ranked teams. I think the comparative part is an important factor in assessing panel B's analysis and panel B's reasonings, right? I think when they bring likelihood and responses and make sure that these likelihood and responses was compared between the team, it's a valuable discussions that will be have on the table if panel B did provide those comparative. Moreover, I think panel B is also even willing to consider others' perspective and change their decisions at the end of the day when they heard the perspective from panel A and the chair. So I think this would also means that panel B is open-minded enough to um, accept other perspective and why theirs might be um, less relevant in comparison to others' consideration as well. So I think that's also things that we want to credit from panel B. From panel A, I think that panel A credit a lot on fluency. I don't think that panel A should do this. Fluency is not a determining factors in choosing which teams ranks first, second, or fourth. So yeah, fluency shouldn't be a consideration. That's the reason why panel A wouldn't receive higher score as well. Secondly, I think that panel A does brings a good discussion to the table, talking about new contextualization. But I think what panel A lacks of was the comparative in weighing the contextualization. I think important point to bring up here is that just because the context is new doesn't mean it's better. Doesn't mean it's better explained as well. So we really need to look and dive deeper into what was the contextualization that's being brought, and that also needs to be comparative. Why these contextualizations more relevant or more important than the contextualizations that was brought in the opening debate. So all in all, I think these are the answer for the first question. Moving on. The second question would be what would be considered as new argument that whip speaker should not bring. So to answer this, it's easier when I just flag out what are new and what are not new, right? So what are new arguments could be two things. First of all, it could be impact to new actors, new stakeholders, or creating a new scope of an impact that hadn't been brought before, that are not derivative from their members' analysis or from the opening benches analysis. Secondly, it would be a new angle or new perspective to the debate that hadn't been brought before. So let's say like the debate never talked about principle and suddenly the whip speaker brings the topic about principle this week we consider new. It's a new angle to the debate that hadn't been talked about before. So these are considered new and which should not be. What are not new arguments? I think we need to flag this up. Some of the answers had failed to address this. Is that What are not new arguments? Deeper analysis is not necessarily new arguments. It could just means more characterization, more contextualization to an existing impact towards the stakeholders that was brought prior to the web speeches being delivered. Could be a actor that member have talked about, but the characterizations could come from the web speaker. These are not new stuff, right? Secondly, analysis on importance, the certain flashes or issues are not considered as new arguments also. So let's say the member has already talked about the actor, but then web speaker comes up and analyze why that actor is an important part of the debate and linked it back to the motion and thus is relevant. I think that is not a new argument. That's just an analysis and the importance of why we need to talk about the actor that the member has been prior to the web speech. So that's the answer. Secondly, third questions debate about legalizing euthanasia. The model proposed by PM is to limit euthanasia only to people with severe illnesses. Prime Minister claimed that this model is very beneficial because those with severe illnesses can have the option to end their suffering. DPM then further elaborated by saying that euthanasia should be legalized because individuals have their body autonomy and is capable of doing and decide what's best for their life. Thus, government cannot dictate the society about what to do. How do you educate this team's argument? So the answer is, I think the model set by PM is acceptable unless there is a definitional challenge by the opposition bench. We can see that this model might not be strategic, might not be persuasive, and cover the whole ground of that motion, but this model inherently is an acceptable model. Um, Towards the DPM arguments then, the DPM argument is strategic in supporting PM's model, understanding that PM had already limited the motion, but then DPM argued on a generic basis on why people can choose whatever they want. This would make it feel less persuasive and make the team feels less coherent, but these should not be directly penalized for contradiction unless it's pointed out by the opposition bench. So basically, all in all, we think that whatever the PM and GPM did here might not be strategic, might not be persuasive, but it should not be directly penalized just because the mechanisms or just because there's contradiction or tension to the case. Um, but we need still to be comparative with the opposition, what the opposition has to offer in comparative to these claims made by the opening government teams in this case. So that's the answer. The next question, the fourth question is you're judging in a room, which all teams are very lacking on responses. However, on the other hand, all teams somehow managed to provide quite substantial arguments to defend their proposal. Based on that situation, what will you do to decide the winner of the debate? Okay, the answer being, I think, understanding that the response was lacking and maybe to an extent was absent, I will give the winning based on the completeness of the team's positive contribution. That is to say, there's substantial arguments. So what I'll do is that I'll do three things, right? First of all, I'll scrutinize the logical gap in each team's argument, understanding that there was no response to the step-by-step analysis. We need to take what's there on the table and see if the team fulfill all the logical gaps within the arguments and whether the arguments are cohesive. Secondly, I would take a look at each team's characterization, context, and whatsoever to prove their case, to defend their proposals, right? These could really be helpful to understand the likelihood of the impact happening or the completeness of the principle by looking at how the teams characterize the actors, the context that are happening in that sense. So I think we need to be comparative also here. What were the characterizations brought by different teams and which are comparatively better? The last thing is that we need to see which team linked their impact to the motion, understanding relevance and importance to the motion. So understanding that they don't respond at all we can still see the relevance of these substantial arguments and their efforts to prove why these arguments are relevant and important to the motions. Um, yeah, so I think we can still scrutinize how they're able to link back this impact to this principle at the end of the day. So yeah, I think that's the answer to the fourth questions. Last short answer questions. In a debate where no teams mentioned the importance of their arguments, which means the previous analysis couldn't be used. How do you pick the metric that determine the ranking and why is that not stepping in? Um, so here how I would assess. I think first of all, in this particular scenario, there are responses, right? So we need to look at it responses to their opposition, their opponent, um, in providing why is it unlikely, pointing out logical gaps. These kind of responses is important to assess whether their arguments stands or not stand despite the lacking analysis on importance. Secondly, the teams attempt to defend their arguments. So this would mean things such as adding likelihood analysis, context, and characterization. When they were questioned by their opponents, they were able to defend their arguments by adding more substantive to it. I think we still can comparatively see how the team attempt to defend their arguments despite the lack of importance in their analysis. Why is this not stepping in, though? I think this is not stepping in since we're assessing in what's actually happening in the debate. And I think that the lack of attempt to frame arguments is not the only determining factor in giving teams a win in a debate. I think as an average reasonable person, we're still able to compare uh, teams' arguments and whether the teams had a standing arguments in comparison to their opposition. And we can still see how the teams defended their arguments and making sure that their substantive claims stand with like likelihood analysis, context, and characterizations. These are given stuff in the debate, and we can still see which argument left standing even without the attempt to frame the argument. So I think all in all, that's the answer for the fifth question. Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Errol and I'm part of the Education Core for DIPO Open 2020 and now I'm going to present to you the exhibition result. So first, let's talk about the ranking and the scoring. After deliberation, the Education Core came into the decision as follows. We give the first rank to closing opposition, with member of opposition scores range from 80 to 81, and opposition whip score range from 80 to 81 as well. We give the second rank towards the opening government, with Prime Minister's score range from 76. The Prime Minister score is 76, and the Deputy Prime Minister score range from 79 to 80. We give the third rank towards the opening opposition, with Leader of Opposition score ranging from 78 to 79, and the Deputy Leader of Opposition score is 73. And finally, the fourth rank is being given to closing government, with member of the government score 75 and government whip score 76. The reasons behind this decision are as follows. The first is about closing opposition. Why closing opposition eventually become the first rank on this debate? First, let's compare closing opposition with opening government. Closing opposition managed to explain the nature of religion and the nature of indoctrination, and thus proving why even if indoctrination will not provide room for questions, the contents of indoctrination will not be that harmful or radical. They managed to flip opening government logic by saying that exactly because we're talking about heterogeneous country, the religious institution will have great incentive to not be radical because they don't want to be seen as a threat to the heterogeneous community. Second of all, the reasons why closing opposition get higher rank in comparison to opening government is because closing opposition managed to widen the spectrum of the debate by explaining the aftermath of the policy. They explain that the moment this policy is being implemented, it will only result into a more radical parents because fear of jail and court procedure will only result into a more resistant action coming from the religious parents towards the progressive value, something that all benches have agreed that to a certain extent this is bad. Closing opposition also managed to prove the comparison that at the very least on their side of the house, even though the parents also not becomes 100% liberal, but at the very least, this religious parent will not have an active aggression or an active effort to continuously or completely prevent their children to get in touch with the progressive value. So the likelihood of the children to actually learn more about the common or the more progressive value is slightly bigger on the closing opposition side. In terms of response, closing government also managed to prove the lack of clarity in government mechanism, such as what kind of procedure that the children will have to go through, what kind of punishment that the parents will serve. Because without all of this mechanism, closing opposition managed to claim that all of the benefits that being offered by open government, such as the benefit of having behavior change or deterrence effect, cannot fly. Second comparison between closing opposition and opening opposition. In comparison to opening opposition, closing opposition managed to bite the bullet and explain why even if it's in the form of indoctrination and not merely basic religious teaching, which is the main nuance of the opening opposition, it is still justified and it will not harm the children. Second of all, even if OO give a very interesting analysis regarding how religious indoctrination is one of the means that being pursued by the parents to create bonding and have meaningful relationship with the children, there is a lack of framing coming from opening opposition to explain why that particular argument is so important on this particular debate and what kind of benefit or harms that will come out of this analysis. Thus, in comparison of the anti-resistant argument that coming from closing opposition, the gravity of harms and benefit that being provided by OO is less in comparison to CO. Last comparison on the first rank between closing opposition and closing government. Closing opposition in the end get higher than closing government mainly because of the lack of responses coming from the closing government. There are a lot of substantial arguments coming from closing opposition that are being served up front from member of opposition. However, the government whip still didn't manage to respond to that. And that's the reasons why closing opposition get the first rank on this debate. The second rank goes to the opening government. I will not explain why opening government lost to closing opposition because I already explained that on my on the previous slides. So now let's focus on the opening government. Let's compare first between opening government and opening opposition. In comparison to OO, OG managed to establish why sewing is acceptable by proving that A, the parents have chances to get better exposure. Understand that this motion operates in a moderate scenario where they're living in a heterogeneous country where information regarding other religions and tolerance is accessible. So there is no reason for parents to indoctrinate and possibly perpetuate radicalization for the children. This argument also directly engaged with OO argument regarding generational trauma, saying that, oh, the parents just do this because they are also a victim of their parents and now they do the same towards their children. OO managed to prove that in the change of times, the parents actually have the chances to actually change. Second of all, or B, OO managed to explain various tangible harms towards the children. For example, how the children might lost some friends, how the children might lose certain opportunity just because of their religion. And OG also managed to explain that when it comes to crimes, because in this case we're talking about suing someone, when we talk about crimes, sometimes the intention does not really matter. As long as you already create a tangible harm, then you can be sued. This analysis also directly clash with opening opposition argument, talking about how, to a certain extent, the parents have a good intention for their children. OG managed to explain that regardless of the intention coming from the parents, however, if you already create a tangible harms, then you deserve to be sued. Third, OG also neutralized the urgency that being brought by OO regarding the needs of guidance for the children. They explain that even if it's true, children need guidance, they explain that indoctrination is not the answer. There are other alternatives, such as basic religious teaching, that can also provide enough guidance for the children. As an addition to that, opening government also explained that also managed to explain the principles regarding that it's still and it will always be acceptable to sue these religious parents, and government will always have the right to dictate the kind of lifestyle or the kind of parenting that being owned by the citizens, because government is responsible for protecting the society from greater harms that comes from indoctrination, for example, radicalization. That's why, because government having the interest to protect the majority of the society, it's justified for government to dictate the parents about what to do, because in the end, if the parents goes wrong and the children goes wrong, the impact of it will also be experienced by the whole nation. Second comparison, regarding OG and CG. We think the reasons as to why OG get upper hand than closing government mainly is because most of the arguments that coming from closing government is having quite similar line of logic with opening government. For example, the idea about how indoctrination harms the growth and development of the children. However, we don't really see any significant contribution that makes CG should be credited more than OG. We acknowledge that as closing team, you don't necessarily have to bring a completely new or different arguments, and using the same premise with your opening is a very justified measures. However, if you want to do that, make sure that you also provide a significant explanation or a significant contribution, that even though you use the same premises, but the significance of your arguments is higher than your opening. So because we didn't see that on the closing government, we credit opening government higher. Second of all, CG does bring interesting and brand new idea, for example, how children needs critical thinking. There's no further substantiation to that argument, and there is lack of framing and explaining why it is the most important argument on this debate. Lastly, about the third rank, opening opposition, and fourth rank, closing government. Here I would like to explain why opening opposition get higher than closing government, and that also explains why in the end closing government get the fourth rank on this debate. First of all, the reasons why opening opposition get higher rank than closing government is because there are a lot of attempts coming from closing government to respond to the arguments from opening opposition. For example, about how emotional bond and meaningful relationship will never be created by opening opposition. But most of these response are in the form of offering alternative rather than neutralizing the arguments that coming from OO. Moreover, there is lack of bring back from the response towards the argument. So for example, closing government does try to challenge and ask about how could you bring a meaningful relationship with your children if you're being such a dictator by telling your children to do this and that through indoctrination. However, they also did not explain why things are going to get comparatively better under the side of the house, the significance of harm of that particular argument, and so on. So we recognize the attempt that coming from CG, however, it's still not enough. Second of all, closing government giving the nuance that indoctrination is a form of abuse. Thus, these particular nuances make their argument harder to be bought, since almost all benches agree that child abuse or physical abuse, be it psychological abuse, all those kind of things are something bad and something harmful, but we already have a separate law and order for it. However, the question would be what kind of specific things that only comes from indoctrination that makes them should be prosecuted as well. And on that particular point, we think that closing government is still unable to explain that. So after all of those reasons, we finally choose closing government as the fourth rank and opening opposition as the third rank. So that is all for the presentations regarding the exhibition result. If you have any further question, you can directly ask me or other education team. Thank you very much for listening and good luck.